first light of the 22nd of September 1980, the Iraqi Air Force bombed airfields and military targets in neighboring Iran. Merely hours later, 200,000 men in 6 divisions crossed the border in the belief that a swift victory would be on their way. Little did they know that it was just the beginning of an 8-year-long conflict that would see hundreds and thousands of casualties. When Iraq gained its independence from Britain, long-standing territorial disputes reignited again with Iran. The Shatt al-Arab waterway plays a vital role in maritime shipping for both nations. Conflicting territorial claims and disputes over navigation rights were among the main factors for the start of the Iran-Iraq War. In 1969, Iran abrogated the treaty over the river and stopped paying tolls for the use of the waterway, a direct response to Iraq's territorial claims over the river. Since neither side was willing to back down but not yet committed to a full-scale conflict, proxy wars in the opposing territories were fought. Iran financed the Kurdish rebellion in the Northern Territory. Iraq, on the other side, supported the separatism in Kazakhstan. From April 1974, the situation would continuously escalate. Both parties would exchange artillery fire along the disputed river. The 1975 Algiers Accords cemented Iran in its leading position, but only in exchange for a downfall of their Kurdish allies. The Algiers Accords was viewed as national humiliation in Iraq, but caused much bitterness over what was seen as Iranian bullying. The humiliation would not go unanswered, and soon Iraq would seek another chance for retaliation. The 1979 revolution in Iran overthrew not only the royal dynasty, but also shifted the paradigms in the world. The newly Islamic Republic and its supreme leader Ayatollah Khomeini was strictly anti-American. Almost immediately, the theocratic government began to purge the military and to suppress the opposition. Over 12,000 army officers were forced into early retirement. Specialists and aviators were executed, expelled or imprisoned. The desertion rate had reached 60% and left the once mighty Iranian army in a weakened state, but it would never recover from. But in their eyes this was just the beginning. The supporters called for an all-out revolution in the whole Islamic world and inspired a dangerous amount of radicals. Islamist insurgents rose up in Saudi Arabia in 1979, in Syria in 1982 and Lebanon in 1983. As Iran was in chaos, Saddam mobilized his army and was about to take advantage of a weakened enemy, or so he thought, because nothing rallies more people to a common cause than an enemy. On September the 22nd, a full-scale ground invasion occurred along the common border. The aim was to take control of the waterway along the oil-rich Kazakhstan province and to rally all enemies of the regime. The war can be separated into 3 main theaters. On the northern front, the Iraqis built strong defense positions to protect the oil industry in the Kurdish Autonomy Zone. The prediction was that Iran would eventually reconnect with its Kurdish allies and seize the northern oil fields, which would be correct. On the central front, the army advanced until Desful in order to block a counter-offensive and cover the advance of the forces into the south. In 1981, during Operation Nasr, it would be the place where over 350 tanks from both sides would hunt each other down in the greatest tank battle of the war. In the end, Iranian misplanning resulted in a decisive defeat. For more than a year, the Central Front withstood any offensive. The bulk of the army advanced into the south, with the goal of occupying the Kazakhstan province and laying siege to Khorramshahr and Abadan. Even though the Iranians were outnumbered, they made up for it with heavy fortifications, trenches and kill zones, which took the Iraqis days to overcome. After a week, they finally stood at the city gates. 5 weeks of intense urban combat eventually made the Iranians retreat towards friendly lines, and Iraq gained a tactical victory, but only on paper. Despite being outnumbered, the garrison took the momentum out of the offensive and overthrew the Iraqi invasion plans, but also gave the Iranians enough time to prepare Abadan. The fighting was so fierce that the city would be given the nickname Kunin Shah, or the City of Blood. It was a small-scale Stalingrad, on which both sides lost about 7,000 men, and the city was down to just a few buildings. However, another Stalingrad just laid a few clicks down the river, Abadan and its precious oil refinery. Abadan was never fully encircled and could be supplied by air, sea and land. For almost 10 months, the Iraqis forced their way into the city at the cost of another 4,000 men and hundreds of armored vehicles. The attrition was so devastating that the first Iranian counteroffensive on the 27th of September 1981 expelled the Iraqis indefinitely. 1 year later, Iran launched Operation Bait al-Moqaddas, which aimed at the liberation of Kazakhstan. About 65,000 Iranians sent the Iraqi army straight back home. About 40,000 Iraqis were either killed or captured, together with about 700 tanks and APCs. But Iran had to pay a high price for the victory. For the liberation of its territory, about 60,000 men were sacrificed. And when I say sacrificed, I really mean in that way. Human wave assaults would be a new common occurrence in the war. Countless child soldiers were sent ahead to clear minefields. Casualty rates of up to 90% per battalion would be no rarity. The liberation sent a shockwave through Iraq. The army was demobilized and several generals were executed. Iraq's navy was destroyed, the air force lost air superiority, and the army has been depleted. The country would lack the power to go on any major offensive for years. Furthermore, Iraq was now in the defense. For the first time in 2 years, a ceasefire was on the table, but destiny had different plans for those nations. Iran would not step down until Iraq was an Islamist republic. Iraq prepared an advanced trench system along the common border that grinded down human waves. Saddam would also receive new international credits, arms deliveries and intel. Also for the first time in this war, chemical weapons would see the battlefield. Iran on the other side had to cannibalize its American and British made hardware for spare parts, since the US sanctions made it quite difficult, but not impossible, to import new equipment. Morale, however, was still high among the population. Operation Ramadan was the first Iranian offensive into enemy territory. Its main objective was to capture the city of Basra. About 150,000 Iranians and 100,000 Iraqis would take part in the largest land battle since World War II. 3 weeks and 20,000 casualties later, and Iran was now the owner of 50 square kilometers of sand. This was just the beginning of a long list of disastrous campaigns. At least in the north, disputed territory could be reclaimed and some territorial gains could be made throughout 1982. In 1983, Iranian offensives in the central sector could claim only minimal gains, and the war largely came to a stalemate in that year. In 1984, however, Iran opened a new front in the north of Iraq. Together with the Kurdish insurgents, Iran staged a guerrilla campaign that threatened the oil fields close to Kirkuk. In the center, Operation Khyber was the attempt to cut off the highway from Basra to Baghdad by an assault through the marshlands. Even though the marshes absorbed explosions, the Iranians were sitting ducks for helicopters and mustard gas. Another 40,000 casualties later, and Iran was the proud owner of Majun Island, an economic hub that holds Iraq's Gulf pipelines. 1982 saw the beginning of the tanker wars and wars of the cities. In order to cripple each other's economy, which was heavily reliant on oil and LNG exports, tankers were hunted down, either with aircraft or patrol boats. The offensives did little damage to the Gulf states, and Iran simply moved its shipping port, while Iraq received help from Kuwait and the US. The War of the Cities was a strategic bombing campaign launched by Iraq, with limited retaliation efforts by Iran. At first it would be a costly war for air superiority, but later a literal Scud missile duel would cause fear among the population. 1985 saw action once again around the Majun oil field and the Baghdad-Basra highway, which was finally captured by Iran. Iraq's counterstrike, however, consisted of flooding Iranian trenches and the use of chemical weapons, which forced the Iranians to surrender their positions with barely any resistance. On the night of the 10th of February 1986, the Iranians launched Operation Dawn 8 with the goal of capturing the Al-Faw Peninsula. 30,000 men crossed the Shatt al-Arab River and overwhelmed the garrison, something that the Iraqis believed would never happen. After just 24 hours, the operation was completed, since badly trained conscripts were abandoning their positions. Counteroffensives were bogged down, and Iran remained the ruler of the peninsula for now. Saddam's response was to take the border city of Mehran and to advance deep into Iranian territory, which was successful at first, until the spearhead ran into an ambush. The counterstrike was so powerful that the Iraqi army lost 9,000 men, 200 tanks and APCs, while Iran got away with just 700 KIAs on their side. The last 2 years saw repeated Iranian offensives on all fronts, with the same results: little gains or massive losses. Slowly but surely, Iran ran out of steam. During another assault on Basra, Iran deployed 200,000 men, of which 60,000 would not return. In the 8th year of the conflict, the Iranian morale crumbled, recruitment dropped, and the equipment losses cancelled any new offensive. The final blow for Iran was the new offensive in Al-4, in which a renewed and highly trained Iraqi army fought the worn-down militias with barely any casualties. In just 2 days, the peninsula changed the owner. Iraq had a steady supply of new equipment, more chemical weapons, and improved training capabilities. The US also involved itself when an Iranian mine damaged an American ship. Countless oil platforms and cruisers were set ablaze as a retaliation. Faced with the odds of fighting the Americans, a crippled economy, low morale, a new full-scale invasion, and even more chemical weapons, the Iranians finally gave in and accepted UN Resolution 598, as well as the status quo from 1975. The fighting eventually ceased and peace was about to return to the Arabic world, but not before Saddam settled an outstanding problem. The Anfal campaign was aimed at driving out Kurdish resistance in the province, but ended in a genocide. Anywhere between 50,000 to 100,000 people were killed by gas or shot. The survivors fled or were incarcerated in detention camps without permissions to return to their homes after the war. Even today, this event barely gained any international attention. The 8-year-long conflict had seen somewhere up to 1 million killed and wounded for both sides. Iraq just had a population of 14 million people, while Iran had 40 million people in the 80s. At one point, every Iraqi male was one way or another involved in the war. The economic loss was believed to exceed 500 billion for each country. In addition, economic development stalled and oil exports were disrupted. Just for comparison, the total oil revenue for both countries have amounted to 420 billion in the past 50 years. Iran's new theocratic government prevails despite the international isolation. The regime is still entangled in worldwide state-sponsored terrorism and also finds itself in a proxy war with Saudi Arabia that ranges from Africa to all over the Middle East. After the war, Iraq's main task was to repay the debt. The country financed its war effort with credits, but was barely able to repay the difference. While the creditors strongly opposed violent Islamic revolutions, they were not so keen on debt forgiveness. On top of that, Kuwait and the UAE were exceeding the OPEC quotas, which led to an overall price decrease that killed the Iraqi budget. Instead of $18 per barrel, $10 was the overall price, a deficit of $7 billion per year for Iraq. Revenues struggled to cover the basic costs, let alone repair damaged infrastructure. Massive demobilization and unemployment on top caused a climate of dissatisfaction, which is not optimal for a dictator, especially if you want to remain one. Iraq fell out of favor with a lot of Gulf states internationally. The loss of reputation and the crippling debt pushed the dictator over the edge. Since no one was willing to support Iraqi rebuilding efforts, Saddam took matters in his own hands and caused a domino effect when he decided to cross the border into Kuwait on the 2nd of August 1990 and initiate the Gulf War.